Welcome to History Teller YT, where we dive deep into the stories that have shaped our world, from the ancient past to the present day. In today's journey, we're exploring the complex and inspiring history of the Subanen and Moro peoples of Mindanao, two distinct communities who resisted centuries of foreign domination. This tale of survival, resilience, and the fight for autonomy offers insights into the unyielding spirit of these indigenous peoples, their struggles for land, cultural preservation, and their ongoing fight for recognition in the modern era. From the fierce wars waged by the Moros against colonial powers to the quiet but powerful resistance of the Subanen through cultural survival, this story encapsulates the battle between tradition and modernity, between sovereignty and assimilation. It is a story that has been ongoing for centuries, and it continues to resonate today. Stay with us to uncover how these two groups have fought to retain their identity and independence through multiple colonizations and the challenges of the contemporary world. So, sit back, relax, and let's journey together through the fascinating history of the Subanen and the Moros of Mindanao. By the end of this, you'll understand not only the struggles they endured, but the lessons we can learn from their resilience. As you've heard in this story, the Moros and the Subanen have faced immense challenges over the centuries, from foreign colonial powers to the modern forces threatening their lands and cultures today. Both groups have demonstrated extraordinary resilience, fighting against the Spanish, the Americans, and even the pressures of the modern Filipino state. The Moros, with their organized resistance and military tactics, have been at the forefront of the struggle for sovereignty, whereas the Subanen have maintained a quieter, yet no less significant form of resistance through the preservation of their traditions and their lands. The Moros, fiercely protecting their sultanates, continued to fight against colonial rule for hundreds of years, from the early battles with Spain in the 1500s to their resistance against the United States in the 20th century. Their legacy of defiance paved the way for modern Moro nationalist movements, most notably the Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF, and the creation of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, BRMM. This was a monumental victory, but the struggle continues as Moro communities still push for greater autonomy and recognition. On the other hand, the Subanen people, whose resistance has been less militarized but equally powerful, have fought to preserve their lands and culture in the face of land encroachment and environmental destruction. Their quiet defiance, rooted in their connection to the land and traditional ways of life, continues today as they seek to protect their ancestral territories from mining, logging, and agricultural exploitation. Their story shows us the strength of cultural resilience and how protecting the land is not just an economic concern, but a deeply spiritual one. In the midst of their ongoing struggles, both groups face the challenge of balancing traditional ways of life with the pressures of modern development. The creation of the BRMM has opened doors for greater autonomy for the Moros, but the Subanen must ensure their own rights and identity are not overshadowed by the region's predominantly Moro agenda. Their stories highlight the ongoing battle for self-determination, land rights, and cultural survival in an ever-changing world. The story of the Moros and Subanen teaches us that survival is not just about military might or political power. It's about cultural resilience, the ability to adapt while staying true to one's identity. The Moros' fierce resistance and the Subanen's quiet endurance remind us that cultural survival is possible even in the face of overwhelming odds. Both groups have shown us that preserving one's culture and land, fighting for sovereignty, and staying true to one's heritage is just as important as the ability to wage war. Their stories are a testament to the power of resilience in the face of adversity and a call to protect the rich cultural and environmental heritage of our world. In the late 1500s, as Spain expanded its empire across Southeast Asia, it set its sights on the Philippine archipelago. The Moro Sultanates, strong and proud, were already firmly entrenched in the islands, with organized states in Sulu, Maguindanao, and Lanao. These sultanates had long established maritime trade networks, with strong ties to the Islamic world. Their strategic position in the Sulu Sea made them crucial players in Southeast Asia's geopolitical landscape. Spain's initial approach was largely focused on converting these Islamic sultanates to Christianity. The Moro people, however, stood fiercely against this intrusion. They were highly organized, led by sultans with supreme authority. The military capabilities of the Moros were formidable, with fleets of fast, agile ships known as vintas, which they used to carry out extensive raids across neighboring islands, including the Visayas and Luzon. The Spanish soon learned that they were facing not just an indigenous resistance, but a well-coordinated force that would prove difficult to subdue. Meanwhile, in the highlands and river valleys of Zamboanga and Misamis, a different reality existed. The Subanen people, unlike the Moros, did not have centralized leadership structures. Their social organization was based around the concept of the Timue, a chief who governed his community through wisdom and consensus rather than military might. The Subanen lived in small, decentralized communities, relying on farming, hunting, and the natural resources provided by the river systems. While the Moros posed an immediate and direct threat to Spanish control, the Subanen presented a more subtle challenge. They did not seek confrontation or war. Instead, they maintained their independence through evasion and endurance. The Spaniards initially saw the Subanen as a less immediate threat than the Moros. They sought to extend their influence over Mindanao's inland areas by imposing settlements known as reduction towns. These were intended to concentrate the indigenous people into controlled villages where they could be converted, taxed, and subjected to labor. While some Subanen initially agreed to these terms, they quickly proved elusive. They would go through the motions of baptism and settlement, only to disappear back into the mountains when Spanish soldiers turned their backs. As the Spaniards focused on the Moro sultanates along the coast, they gradually began to realize the scale of their task. The Moros fought back with fierce resistance, turning the coastal regions into a battleground. In contrast, the Subanen continued to quietly resist by maintaining their cultural autonomy and resisting Spanish efforts to control their movements. The Spaniards were caught in a difficult position. While they sought to dominate the Moros with military force, they found themselves largely powerless against the silent, ongoing defiance of the Subanen. As the Spaniards pushed deeper into Mindanao, they found themselves confronting two distinct societies, each with a different form of resistance. On one hand, the Moros responded with open defiance through warfare. On the other, the Subanen resisted through survival, culture, and geography. These two contrasting paths to freedom shaped the history of Mindanao during the Spanish colonial era. The Moro way, defiance by war. The Moro sultanates had long resisted outside domination. They were well-armed and organized, able to muster large fleets of vintas and thousands of soldiers to defend their sovereignty. Spanish military expeditions were launched against the Sultanate of Sulu as early as 1578, but the first engagement ended in failure for the Spaniards. They faced fierce resistance from the well-trained Moro warriors, who were capable of organizing coordinated military campaigns across the region. In the 1600s and 1700s, the Spanish continued their attempts to conquer the Moros but met with limited success. The Moros, meanwhile, continued to raid coastal settlements in the Visayas, striking fear into the hearts of Spanish officials. One of the most devastating raids occurred in 1754 when Moro forces attacked towns in Cebu, Bohol, Leyte, and other islands, killing thousands and capturing many more. This series of raids exposed the weakness of the Spanish hold on the southern Philippines and led to the construction of several forts, including Fort Pilar in Zamboanga, 1635, Fort Santiago in Ozamis, 1756, and other forts in Iligan and Cotabato. Despite these fortifications, the Spanish were unable to control the vast seas and territories where the Moros ruled. The sultans of Sulu and Mindanao, as well as the Marineos of Lanuo, proved to be formidable adversaries. They organized their warriors under one banner, launching daring raids into enemy waters and consistently demonstrating that they were not to be subdued by mere military force. Even as Spain built its fortresses along the coast, the Moro sultans maintained control over the sea, striking back with brutal counterattacks. For nearly 3 centuries, Spain was unable to decisively defeat the Moro Sultanates. Their resistance was not only military, but deeply rooted in their cultural and religious identity. The Moros were able to defend their land and culture through continued warfare and their strategic maritime capabilities. Their resistance formed a critical part of Mindanao's history, establishing a legacy of defiance that would persist even after the Spanish departure in 1898. The Subanen way, resistance by survival. While the Moros fought openly, the Subanen adopted a different form of resistance, one that was less visible but equally powerful. The Subanen, unlike the Moros, did not possess the military organization or resources to confront the Spaniards head-on. Instead, they resisted through withdrawal and survival. Their communities, spread along the rivers of Zamboanga and Misamis, were scattered and elusive. This geographical isolation made them difficult to subjugate. When the Spanish attempted to force the Subanen into reduction towns, they complied at first but quickly returned to their original homes in the mountains and river valleys. The Subanen were not merely fleeing the Spanish, but were engaging in a form of resistance by refusal. They resisted both the missionaries who sought to convert them and the soldiers who demanded tribute and labor. They preserved their culture, beliefs, and way of life by staying out of reach of Spanish control. The Subanen's resistance was not through open battle, but through the quiet endurance of their way of life. They maintained their decentralized communities and continued to practice their traditional rituals. The Timue, though not a military leader, was a chief who held moral and spiritual authority over the people. The Balian, the shaman, continued to lead healing rituals and agricultural ceremonies that were central to Subanen identity. Despite the Spanish attempts to eradicate these practices, the Subanen kept their traditions alive in secret. Additionally, the Subanen resisted Spanish religious influence. While they were baptized by priests, they would often return to their homes in the mountains, where they could practice their original belief systems in peace. Spanish missionaries, frustrated by the Subanen's refusal to stay in their settlements, complained about their inconstant nature. What the Spaniards failed to understand was that the Subanen's wandering was not mere evasion, but a deliberate act of cultural survival. As the Spanish colonization of Mindanao progressed, the Subanen found themselves caught between 2 opposing forces. On one side were the Moros, with their powerful fleets and fierce raids. On the other side were the Spaniards, with their military forts and attempts to assimilate the indigenous peoples. The Subanen did not align with either side but carved out their own path, a third way defined by independence, survival, and resistance through isolation. The Subanen's dilemma. For the Subanen, the question of whether to align with the Spanish or the Moros was a difficult one. The Moros, despite their shared Muslim faith, were raiders who often captured and enslaved people from the inland areas. The Spanish, on the other hand, were colonizers who sought to impose foreign customs, religious beliefs, and forced labor. Neither side represented the interests of the Subanen. The Spaniards, well aware of the strategic importance of the river systems and fertile lands of Zamboanga and Misamis, sought to consolidate control over these regions. They presented themselves as protectors against the Moro raids, offering safety and security in exchange for submission. Yet, the Subanen were deeply distrustful of the Spanish. To them, the Spanish were invaders seeking to impose a foreign way of life on them. The Moros, despite their territorial claims, were no better. They were feared raiders who preyed on the weak and defenseless. Thus, the Subanen chose not to ally with either force. Instead, they remained largely neutral, avoiding direct conflict with the Spanish and the Moros while holding onto their land, their traditions, and their independence. This form of resistance was subtle but effective. By not aligning with either side, the Subanen were able to preserve their autonomy in a region caught between two forces, both of which had the power to destroy them. The Subanen's resistance was not passive. They fought to maintain their traditional way of life. Their communities remained elusive, and their leaders, the Timues, worked to guide their people through the treacherous political landscape. The Subanen did not engage in open warfare as the Moros did, but they were relentless in their refusal to be assimilated. They resisted by continuing to live as they had before the Spanish arrived, by farming, fishing, and hunting along the rivers, and by celebrating their spiritual rituals in the forests. The Spanish chronicles of the time tell of the Subanen's refusal to remain in the reduction towns. These towns were meant to concentrate the indigenous population, making them easier to convert to Christianity and tax. But the Subanen avoided this by fleeing into the mountains, where they continued their agricultural practices and held on to their traditional religious beliefs. The Subanen's persistence in resisting Spanish control was not through overt defiance, but through quiet, unyielding survival. Survival through geography. The Subanen's geography played a crucial role in their resistance. The rugged terrain of Zamboanga and Misamis, with its mountain ranges and river systems, provided natural defenses against Spanish encroachment. The Subanen used the land to their advantage, building their communities in places that were difficult for the Spanish to access. This geographical advantage allowed them to live in relative isolation, making it hard for the Spanish to establish direct control over them. The river systems that ran through Subanen territory also served as crucial lifelines, allowing them to remain connected with one another while avoiding Spanish settlements. By relying on these natural features, the Subanen were able to maintain their autonomy and sustain their traditional way of life. The rivers were not only a means of transportation, but also symbolized the Subanen's connection to their land and culture. Their survival depended on their ability to navigate the complex waterways, avoiding the Spanish and the Moros, and maintaining their distance from both powers. In this way, the Subanen created a space for themselves between two competing forces. Their geographical isolation, combined with their unwavering resistance to both the Spanish and the Moros, allowed them to survive and preserve their culture. They did not wage war like the Moros, but they fought to maintain their way of life in a world that sought to erase them. This quiet form of resistance was just as powerful as the open battles fought by the Moros. It was a resistance defined by endurance, survival, and an unwavering commitment to preserving their culture and traditions. By the 19th century, Spain's presence in Mindanao was becoming more entrenched along the coastlines. However, despite the presence of military forts, Spanish authority was still limited. The Spanish-controlled areas were confined mainly to the coastal regions and a few key towns, while vast areas of Mindanao remained largely unconquered. Despite their best efforts, Spain had not succeeded in fully pacifying the entire region, especially the inland areas where the Subanen lived, and the Moro Sultanates were still able to maintain their independence and military prowess. Continued resistance from the Moros. The Moros, particularly the sultans of Sulu and Maguindanao, continued to fiercely resist Spanish control throughout the 1800s. Spanish efforts to fully integrate the Moro Sultanates into their empire met with constant defiance. The capture of the Balangingi Samal stronghold in 1851 by Spanish forces was a significant victory, but it did not mark the end of Moro resistance. Even with this victory, the Moros continued to wage guerrilla warfare, raiding Spanish settlements, striking fear into the colonial authorities. The Moros' naval dominance remained unchallenged. The fast Ventas, which had served as their primary means of transportation and war during the 16th and 17th centuries, remained integral to their military strategy. With their fleets, they were able to launch swift raids on Spanish-held towns in the Visayas and Luzon. The Spanish forts along the coasts, such as Fort Pilar in Zamboanga and Fort Santiago in Aligan, were isolated outposts in a sea dominated by Moro forces. The Sultanates' continued raids deep into Spanish-held territories were a testament to their resilience and ability to challenge the might of the empire. By the mid-1800s, the Spanish finally recognized that they could not fully subdue the Moros through military force alone. They resorted to diplomatic strategies, attempting to create treaties with the sultans in an effort to limit the frequency of attacks. However, these treaties were often violated by both sides, and the conflict continued, with neither the Moros nor the Spanish able to decisively end the war. For the Moros, the 19th century represented a period of enduring sovereignty, albeit in a form of continuous warfare. They had successfully resisted Spanish control for centuries, and despite some military setbacks, the Moros' ability to maintain their independence remained a central aspect of Mindanao's history. The Spanish colonial empire, while deeply entrenched in other parts of the Philippines, was unable to fully integrate the southern islands, a testament to the fierce will of the Moro people. Subanen resilience in the shadows. While the Moros fought openly in battle, the Subanen continued their quiet, persistent resistance. Spanish records from the 19th century often mentioned the Subanen in passing, frustrated by their refusal to stay in the reduction towns and their continued adherence to their indigenous beliefs. The Subanen did not engage in open battle like the Moros, but their resistance was no less significant. One of the key aspects of the Subanen resistance was their ability to remain hidden from the Spanish authorities. Spanish missionaries and soldiers struggled to keep track of the Subanen, who remained elusive in the remote river valleys and mountain ranges of Zamboanga and Misamis. When forced to live in towns, they would quickly escape back into the wilderness, where they could live freely and practice their traditional ways without fear of colonial oversight. Throughout the 19th century, the Subanen's primary resistance strategy was one of endurance. They did not seek confrontation with either the Spanish or the Moros, but instead focused on maintaining their cultural practices and autonomy. Spanish missionaries often expressed frustration with the Subanen's inability to remain in the reduction towns, a clear sign of their unwillingness to be absorbed into the colonial system. Despite being surrounded by both the Spanish and the Moros, the Subanen managed to survive in the margins, continuing to live as they had for generations. The Subanen maintained their cultural practices in the shadows. Their religious rituals, such as the bucklog, a large Thanksgiving ceremony, were held in secret, despite being outlawed by the Spanish. These ceremonies were vital in maintaining the spiritual health of their communities and were acts of resistance against the imposition of Spanish Christianity. The Subanen's ability to preserve their way of life, even in the face of pressure from both the Spanish and the Moros, was a form of quiet rebellion, one that did not involve warfare, but instead relied on cultural survival and geographical isolation. In the 1800s, as the Spanish Empire faced growing resistance across its colonies, the Subanen's endurance in the remote mountains and rivers of Mindanao allowed them to maintain their independence. They were not passive victims of colonization, but active participants in their own survival, choosing to live apart from both the Spanish and the Moros, carving out a space where they could continue their traditional way of life. In 1898, the Spanish Empire, weakened by internal turmoil and external conflict, was forced to surrender the Philippines to the United States following the Spanish-American War. This marked the official end of Spanish colonial rule in the archipelago. However, the Moros and the Subanen were far from defeated. Despite their long-standing resistance to Spanish domination, both groups continued to maintain their distinct forms of sovereignty and cultural identity, even as the Spanish left and a new power, the United States, arrived. The Moro Sultanates, surviving 3 centuries of warfare. The Moros had endured over 300 years of warfare against the Spanish. From the first battles in the late 1500s to the continued raids in the 1800s, they had maintained their independence through relentless military resistance. By the time Spain formally ceded control of the Philippines to the United States, the Moro Sultanates had not been conquered. The sultans of Sulu and Maguindanao, along with the Marineos of Lanao, still controlled large portions of Mindanao, with their powerful naval fleets continuing to dominate the seas. When the United States took over the Philippines in 1898, the Moros initially sought to negotiate their sovereignty with the new colonial power. However, the U.S. did not recognize the Moro Sultanates as independent entities. The Moros, who had resisted centuries of Spanish domination, now found themselves facing another foreign power that was determined to extend its control over their lands. The U.S. government sought to pacify the Moro Sultanates through a series of military campaigns. The most famous of these was the Battle of Budajo in 1906, where American forces massacred hundreds of Moro civilians who had taken refuge in a mountain stronghold. Despite these military defeats, the Moro resistance did not end. The Moro people continued to fight for their sovereignty and independence, leading to further conflicts throughout the early 20th century. The struggle for Moro independence, however, was far from over. The U.S. occupation marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Moro resistance movement, one that would continue through the subsequent decades, eventually evolving into the Moro separatist movement of the 1970s. The Subanen, surviving through cultural resilience. For the Subanen, the change in colonial power from Spain to the United States did not lead to a shift in their approach to survival. The Subanen had long resisted both the Spanish and the Moros by refusing to engage in direct conflict. Their strategy had always been one of quiet defiance, resisting colonization through cultural preservation and geographical isolation. This form of resistance, while less visible than the open warfare waged by the Moros, had proven effective in ensuring the Subanen's survival. Under American rule, the Subanen were largely ignored by the new colonial authorities, who focused their attention on the larger, more strategically important Moro Sultanates. The Subanen's remote communities, located in the mountains and along the rivers of Zamboanga and Misamis, remained largely outside the reach of American control. The U.S. did not have the manpower or resources to fully pacify these areas, and the Subanen, with their deep connection to the land and their unyielding resistance to assimilation, continued to live much as they had during the Spanish era. The Subanen's ability to survive under both Spanish and American colonial rule was rooted in their strength as a people who lived outside the colonial system. Their decentralized social structure, with each community governed by a timue, allowed them to remain autonomous and self-sufficient. The Subanen continued to practice their traditional farming and fishing techniques, relying on the rivers and mountains that had sustained them for generations. They maintained their rituals, including the bucklog, in the secrecy of their remote villages, defying both Spanish and American efforts to erase their cultural identity. While the Spanish had sought to force the Subanen into reduction towns, the Americans made no significant effort to change the Subanen's way of life. The Subanen were not seen as a direct threat to the colonial authorities, and thus they were largely left alone. This allowed them to continue their resistance in the form of cultural survival, preserving their language, beliefs, and practices for future generations. A legacy of resistance. The end of Spanish rule in 1898 did not mark the end of resistance in Mindanao. Both the Moros and the Subanen had survived 3 centuries of colonization, one through open warfare, the other through quiet endurance. In the end, both groups remained unconquered, and their cultures continued to thrive in the face of foreign domination. The history of Mindanao in the 19th and early 20th centuries is a testament to the resilience of these two peoples. The Moros, with their unyielding determination and military prowess, fought for their sovereignty for centuries. The Subanen, in contrast, resisted through their ability to maintain their culture and autonomy in the face of overwhelming odds. As the Spanish Empire withdrew from the Philippines and the United States took over, both the Moros and the Subanen held on to their identities and their lands. Their stories, one of defiance by war, the other of resistance through survival, form a critical part of the history of Mindanao and the Philippines as a whole. When the United States took control of the Philippines after Spain's defeat in the Spanish-American War, they inherited a complex and deeply resistant society in Mindanao. The Moros, who had long resisted both the Spanish and the earlier Muslim conquests, and the Subanen, who had quietly maintained their autonomy, now faced a new colonial power. While the Spanish had established some degree of control, the Moros and Subanen had not been fully pacified, and the American forces were determined to impose their rule over Mindanao. Yet, the history of Mindanao's resistance was far from over. The U.S. approach to Mindanao. The American colonial administration in the Philippines initially took a more strategic approach to controlling Mindanao. The U.S. viewed the region as a vital part of its imperial holdings, largely due to its strategic position in the Southeast Asian seas. The Americans aimed to stabilize the region and extend their influence across the archipelago. This included military campaigns, the establishment of government structures, and a shift toward a more direct and centralized control over Mindanao. However, the Moros posed a significant challenge to U.S. rule, much as they had done with the Spanish. The U.S. Army's response to the Moro resistance was brutal and often involved large-scale military campaigns. One of the most infamous events was the Battle of Budejo in 1906, where American forces massacred hundreds of Moro civilians who had taken refuge on a volcanic crater. This battle, along with others like it, cemented the Moro resistance as one of the most formidable in the Philippines' history. Despite these attempts to crush Moro resistance, the Moros continued to fight. Many sultans and leaders who had resisted Spanish rule now confronted a new foreign force determined to impose a different form of governance. The U.S. faced the same problem as the Spanish. While they could control coastal areas, they struggled to fully dominate the interior, particularly the Moro Sultanates. The Moros had a long tradition of guerrilla warfare, making them difficult to conquer. Even with the U.S. military superiority, the battle for control over Mindanao remained contentious and fiercely contested. The Subanen's continued survival and cultural persistence. For the Subanen, the shift from Spanish to American rule did not bring significant change in their way of life. Unlike the Moros, the Subanen were not a direct threat to the American military, and thus, the new colonial administration did not prioritize them as much as the Moros. As a result, the Subanen were able to continue living relatively untouched by the colonial power. Their geographic isolation in the mountains and rivers made it difficult for the Americans to establish control over them. However, the arrival of the Americans brought new pressures. Though the Subanen were not subjected to large military campaigns as the Moros were, they still faced attempts at assimilation. The U.S. government sought to modernize the Philippines by introducing new forms of governance, education, and religion, and the Subanen were not exempt from these changes. American missionaries, much like their Spanish predecessors, attempted to convert the Subanen to Christianity. Yet, the Subanen remained steadfast in their cultural resistance, adhering to their traditions and customs. The Subanen's strategy of resistance, which had been largely passive during the Spanish era, continued under American rule. They did not engage in open conflict, but focused on maintaining their identity through cultural preservation. They continued their agricultural practices, relying on the river systems and the mountains that had always sustained them. The Subanen kept their spiritual practices alive, including the performance of rituals like the bucklog, which was central to their identity. While the Spanish had attempted to force them into reduction towns, the Americans found it much harder to enforce these policies. The Subanen were able to maintain their autonomy in the face of American colonization. The changing landscape of Mindanao. The early American period in Mindanao marked a time of transition, where the Spanish colonial legacy collided with the new American administration. The Moros, once again, found themselves at war with an external power, while the Subanen continued their quiet resistance by maintaining their way of life. The Americans struggled to deal with both groups. Their military campaigns, while successful in some areas, often proved ineffective in fully pacifying the region. The Subanen's resilience in surviving these turbulent times was not just about evading control. It was about preserving a way of life that had been passed down through generations. The Subanen knew the value of their traditions, which held their communities together and provided a sense of unity and identity. In a world where both the Spanish and the Americans sought to impose their systems, the Subanen stood as a testament to the power of cultural endurance. They were not simply surviving. They were resisting through their traditions, geography, and refusal to submit to foreign rule. Despite being less visible than the Moros, the Subanen's quiet resistance was just as powerful. They had learned the art of survival from their long history of evasion and cultural preservation. The shifting colonial powers, whether Spanish or American, did not change their commitment to independence. Their ability to adapt to each new colonizer without losing their identity marked the Subanen as one of the most resilient indigenous groups in the Philippines. A new era of resistance. As the 20th century continued, the power dynamics in Mindanao continued to shift. The Moros, after enduring centuries of warfare, began to see the emergence of a new form of resistance, a more organized political movement. The Subanen, too, would have to adapt, although they were more likely to do so through cultural and geographical means rather than through open conflict. As the U.S. established its control over the Philippines, the challenges in Mindanao remained formidable. The Moro resistance, after more than 3 centuries of continuous struggle against Spanish colonial rule, now found itself confronting a new empire with a different approach. The U.S. military's initial attempts to pacify the Moros were marked by brutal confrontations, but despite these campaigns, the Moros continued to resist American domination. Unlike the previous Spanish forces, the U.S. administration took a different approach, balancing military intervention with promises of modernization and a degree of self-rule for the Moro people. The U.S. strategy and the continuing Moro resistance. The early American presence in Mindanao was characterized by military campaigns aimed at eliminating Moro resistance. The Battle of Budejo, a massacre in 1906, remains one of the most infamous episodes in the struggle. Here, U.S. forces faced Moro fighters who had sought refuge in a mountain stronghold, and in the ensuing conflict, over 600 Moros were killed, including women and children. Despite this, the Moros did not surrender. The persistence of the Moro Sultanates in resisting U.S. control continued as they maintained their traditional power structures, which included armed forces and fortified towns that acted as strongholds. The Americans, recognizing the difficulty in completely defeating the Moros through military force, began to shift tactics in the early 20th century. The strategy evolved into a combination of military pressure, economic incentives, and attempts to integrate Moro leaders into the political system through cooperation rather than conflict. In exchange for political autonomy and promises of religious freedom, some Moro sultans agreed to cooperate with American authorities. Yet, this cooperation did not always last, and many Moro leaders remained suspicious of the U.S. intentions, still committed to defending their sovereignty and independence. This shifting strategy allowed the Moros to retain a degree of autonomy in their local affairs, but the conflict never truly subsided. The Moros continued to assert their identity as a distinct people, with their own traditions, religions, and customs, in defiance of the U.S. attempts to incorporate them into the broader Philippine governance structure. The Moro resistance was a multifaceted struggle, one that involved political negotiations, military skirmishes, and an unwavering commitment to cultural survival. The Subanen continued cultural resilience. While the Moros were engaged in military confrontations, the Subanen maintained their traditional way of life with far less open resistance. Although they were not targeted for military intervention in the same way as the Moros, the Subanen were still affected by the broader changes that came with American rule. The Subanen's geographical isolation in the mountains and river valleys of Mindanao protected them from direct military campaigns, but this did not mean they were immune from the larger forces at play in the Philippines. The Americans, like the Spanish, sought to bring the Subanen into the colonial fold through missionary work and the introduction of American education. While the Moros were able to engage in political negotiations, the Subanen were more likely to face efforts to assimilate them through the introduction of Western values. The American government, eager to civilize and modernize the indigenous populations, introduced new policies that aimed at breaking down the Subanen's traditional social structures. The Subanen's response to these pressures was again one of resistance through survival. They maintained their decentralized political system, with the Timue continuing to hold authority in their communities. The Subanen resisted both external colonization and internal pressures to adopt foreign customs. They refused to abandon their ancestral lands and continued to live off the natural resources of the rivers and mountains, holding on to the skills that had kept them independent for centuries. In the early 20th century, the Subanen's cultural practices remained largely intact. Although the U.S. government pushed for the establishment of schools and churches, the Subanen remained committed to their indigenous belief systems. The Balian, or shamans, continued to lead important cultural rituals and maintain spiritual healing practices. These acts of cultural defiance, while not as visible as the Moro resistance, played a vital role in the Subanen's survival. By upholding their traditional ways, the Subanen rejected both the Spanish and American attempts to alter their way of life. The Subanen's survival strategy. The Subanen's strategy of survival was rooted in a deep connection to their land. The rivers and mountains of Zamboanga and Misamis were not just geographical features, but sacred spaces that defined their identity. These places allowed the Subanen to live in relative autonomy, away from the direct reach of colonial powers. The Subanen's ability to navigate the rugged terrain, moving between the rivers and mountains, was key to their survival. Furthermore, the Subanen's social structure, with its focus on communal decision-making and leadership through the Timue, enabled them to maintain a sense of unity and purpose despite external pressures. The Timue acted as both a political and spiritual leader, ensuring that the community's traditions were upheld and that the people remained connected to their heritage. By maintaining this structure, the Subanen were able to resist external forces that sought to dismantle their identity. The Subanen also kept their ceremonies alive, particularly the buklog, a Thanksgiving ritual that brought the community together to celebrate the harvest and express gratitude to the spirits. The buklog was not just a religious ceremony, but a statement of resistance, as it was often performed in secret to avoid the attention of both Spanish and American authorities. These rituals reinforced the Subanen's connection to their land, their traditions, and their ancestors. In this way, the Subanen showed that resistance could take many forms, sometimes through open warfare, as in the case of the Moros, and other times through cultural survival. Both paths were vital in preserving the identity of the people of Mindanao. As the United States consolidated its control over the Philippines in the early 20th century, the history of Mindanao became increasingly defined by the interaction between American imperialism and the long-standing resistance of the Moro and Subanen peoples. While the U.S. aimed to integrate Mindanao into a unified colonial system. Both the Moros and the Subanen maintained distinct identities that defied foreign domination. The Moros, through armed resistance, and the Subanen, through cultural survival, continued to assert their autonomy in the face of growing colonial pressures. U.S. policies and the challenge of governance. The American government recognized that Mindanao was a region of strategic importance, especially given its rich resources and its role in the wider geopolitics of Southeast Asia. However, the Moros' continued resistance and the Subanen's refusal to integrate into colonial society posed a major challenge for the U.S. colonial administration. The U.S. sought to implement policies that would modernize the region and bring it under centralized control, but this approach often clashed with the desires of the indigenous peoples to retain their autonomy. One of the main strategies the U.S. pursued was the establishment of the Moro province in 1903. This administrative division was intended to address the complexities of governing a region with strong local identities, including the Moro Sultanates and other indigenous groups like the Subanen. The goal was to create a centralized system that could exert greater control over the local populations. The U.S. government introduced policies aimed at economic development, such as the establishment of agricultural programs and infrastructure projects, as well as attempts to integrate the region into the broader Philippine economy. Yet, these policies were often met with resistance, particularly from the Moros, who saw them as a direct threat to their sovereignty. The Americans also sought to implement a policy of pacification in Mindanao, using both military force and diplomatic means to neutralize opposition. The U.S. military continued to conduct operations against the Moro Sultanates, including large-scale campaigns like the Battle of Budejo and the Moro Massacre. However, despite these military efforts, the Moros never fully succumbed to U.S. rule. The Moros' resistance, though deeply damaging to the American forces, ultimately preserved a sense of sovereignty within the Moro Sultanates, especially in the southern Philippines. Meanwhile, the Subanen, less politically organized than the Moros, had a different kind of resistance, one that was rooted in their ability to stay outside of the formal structures of American rule. With their isolated communities in the mountains, the Subanen were largely untouched by the changes that swept across other parts of Mindanao. The American government, though still eager to expand its control, found it difficult to impose its will on the Subanen in the same way it did with the Moros. The Subanen's relationship with the U.S. government. While the Moros engaged in overt warfare, the Subanen resisted in ways that were less visible but equally effective. In the face of U.S. colonial efforts, the Subanen's response was one of cultural and geographic resistance. Their remote, river-based settlements were difficult for the U.S. authorities to reach, and the Subanen took advantage of their physical isolation to maintain their traditional ways of life. Much like the Spanish missionaries, the Americans tried to convert the Subanen to Christianity and introduce Western education, but their efforts were often met with indifference or quiet opposition. The U.S. government attempted to integrate the Subanen into its new colonial system through a variety of means. Educational programs were introduced with the goal of assimilating the indigenous peoples of Mindanao, including the Subanen. Missionary groups were also active, seeking to convert the Subanen to Christianity. However, the Subanen maintained a strong sense of cultural identity and refused to abandon their traditional practices. Their resistance to colonial education was rooted in the desire to preserve their language, customs, and religious beliefs. The Subanen's ability to remain outside the formal structures of American rule allowed them to maintain a sense of autonomy in a rapidly changing world. The U.S. government, recognizing that direct military control would be inefficient in dealing with the Subanen, focused on attempts at indirect rule. The government sought to encourage economic development in the region, promoting agricultural programs and establishing new roads and infrastructure. However, the Subanen's traditional subsistence farming methods, rooted in their deep knowledge of the land, were not easily disrupted. They continued to rely on the natural resources of their environment, farming, fishing, and hunting in the river valleys and mountains. Through these practices, they ensured their survival without becoming fully integrated into the American colonial economy. The Subanen's survival through the early American period was also marked by the continued practice of their rituals. The bucklog ceremony, which had been banned by the Spanish, continued to be held in secret as a defiant act of cultural preservation. These ceremonies allowed the Subanen to express their connection to the land, to their ancestors, and to the spiritual forces that they believed governed their lives. By maintaining these rituals, the Subanen not only ensured the survival of their cultural identity, but also sent a powerful message of resistance to the forces of colonization. The endurance of Moro resistance. For the Moros, the advent of American rule in 1898 did not signify the end of their resistance. The U.S. military continued to face sporadic skirmishes with Moro forces, and many of the Moro sultans maintained their political independence, negotiating with the American government for autonomy. The persistence of Moro resistance, especially in the southern Philippines, continued to complicate U.S. efforts to establish complete control. The Moro people's commitment to their religion, culture, and political structures ensured that their resistance would last for decades to come. Though the U.S. imposed military control and sought to transform the social fabric of the region, the Moros' resilience ensured that they would continue to play a central role in the political landscape of Mindanao. The U.S. was unable to fully extinguish the Moro spirit of resistance, which would later influence the growth of the Moro nationalist and separatist movements in the 20th century. The legacy of Moro resistance to foreign powers, whether Spanish or American, would live on as a foundational element of their struggle for autonomy. The early decades of the 20th century saw the persistence of Moro resistance, albeit under evolving circumstances. By the time the Philippines was granted independence from the United States in 1946, the legacy of Moro defiance against colonial powers was already deeply embedded in the region's political landscape. However, the American efforts to pacify the region and integrate the Moros into the broader Philippine political system continued to face resistance, and this struggle would give rise to the modern Moro nationalist movement. The shift from military to political resistance. As the United States consolidated its control over Mindanao, the Moro Sultanates were gradually incorporated into the newly established political structure of the Philippines. This shift from military to political resistance reflected the changing nature of the struggle. In the early 1900s, Moro forces had fought against the U.S. military through guerrilla warfare, raids, and defiance. But by mid-century, the nature of resistance began to change. The once prominent sultanates, such as those of Sulu and Mindanao, saw their power diminish under the new colonial order. Despite the absence of open warfare, the Moros' resistance remained strong, though it took on a more subtle form. The Moros, particularly in the Sulu archipelago and Mindanao, began to challenge the integration of their territories into the new Philippine Republic. The resistance was no longer just military in nature, but became an increasingly vocal demand for autonomy, self-determination, and recognition of the Moro people's distinct culture and religion within the broader Filipino nation. The turning point came in the 1960s and 1970s when growing discontent over marginalization and discrimination led to the emergence of the Moro nationalist movement. This movement sought to regain the political and cultural autonomy that the Moros had fought so hard to preserve throughout the colonial period. The Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF, formed in 1969, became the key organization leading the struggle for Moro independence. It represented the culmination of centuries of Moro resistance against foreign domination. The Subanen's continued isolation and survival. While the Moros were engaged in a more overt struggle for autonomy, the Subanen remained largely isolated from the political and military upheavals that marked the modern nationalist movement. For much of the early 20th century, the Subanen lived in the remote areas of Zamboanga and Misamis, where they continued to practice their traditional way of life. While the Moros were organizing politically, the Subanen's resistance continued through cultural survival and maintaining their independence from both the Spanish and American colonial powers. The Subanen's survival strategies were rooted in a deep sense of cultural continuity and geographical isolation. Their decentralized, river-based communities remained elusive to external influences. The Subanen's commitment to their cultural practices, including their religious rituals, farming techniques, and traditional governance systems, enabled them to navigate the changing political and social landscape of Mindanao. Throughout the early years of the Philippine Republic, the Subanen remained relatively untouched by the larger political forces in the country. While their struggles were not as visible as the Moros' military confrontations, their resistance was just as vital to their survival. The Subanen continued to resist assimilation by maintaining their independence and autonomy, choosing to remain outside the formal structures of the Filipino state. They avoided becoming part of the political mainstream, preserving their cultural identity even as the nation around them modernized and changed. The legacy of resistance. As the Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF, began its campaigns for an independent Bangsamoro state in the 1970s, the legacy of Moro resistance to colonial powers, including Spain and the United States, became central to the modern struggle. The MNLF's demands for autonomy and self-determination were rooted in a history of resistance that stretched back for centuries. The Moros' desire for sovereignty had been a constant thread throughout their history, and it had endured despite the relentless pressure from foreign powers. At the same time, the Subanen, though not as directly involved in the nationalist movement, maintained their independence. The Subanen's refusal to conform to the political systems imposed by both colonial and post-colonial governments remained a powerful testament to their resilience. They had long rejected the forces of assimilation that sought to erase their cultural identity. As the Moro struggle for self-determination gained momentum, the Subanen continued their quiet defiance, ensuring that their way of life, though less politically vocal, was still a form of resistance to the pressures of the modern state. The Subanen's enduring cultural survival throughout the 20th century stood as a reminder of the ways in which indigenous peoples in the Philippines resisted colonization and modernity. While the Moros' resistance took the form of armed struggle and political organization, the Subanen's resistance was rooted in the preservation of their traditions, languages, and way of life. Both peoples, in their own ways, demonstrated the power of identity and culture in the face of external domination. A new phase of struggle. By the 1970s, as the MNLF's campaign for Moro independence gained momentum, the Philippine government faced increasing pressure to address the grievances of the Moro people. The creation of the Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, ARMM, in 1989 was one attempt to address these issues, but it was far from a resolution. The legacy of Moro resistance continued, and the demand for greater autonomy persisted throughout the latter half of the 20th century. The MNLF and later the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, MILF, pushed for full independence, while the Philippine government struggled to find a solution that would ensure both peace and the recognition of Moro autonomy. For the Subanen, however, the struggle for survival continued largely in the shadows of the larger political conflicts. Their resistance remained cultural, continuing the quiet defiance that had been their hallmark for centuries. The Subanen story, though not as widely recognized as the Moros, is one of resilience, a story of survival through the preservation of identity, language, and culture in the face of colonization, modernization, and state building. The 20th century, especially the post-World War II era, was pivotal in the evolution of resistance movements across Mindanao, particularly the rise of the Moro nationalist movement. Following the establishment of the Philippine Republic, the Moros, still reeling from centuries of foreign domination, began to take more organized steps towards self-determination. The Subanen, on the other hand, continued their quiet survival amidst the shifting political landscape, emphasizing cultural preservation and autonomy through isolation. The birth of the Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF. In the 1960s, the Moro people's long-standing discontent with the government of the newly independent Philippines reached a boiling point. Over decades of perceived marginalization and disenfranchisement, especially in the face of increasing settler migration into Moro territories, the idea of Moro independence began to crystallize. The Philippines government's failure to address the economic and political issues faced by the Moro people, along with the increasing resentment over the erosion of their culture, religion, and autonomy, fueled the rise of Moro separatism. The Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF, was established in 1969 by Nur Miswari and other Moro leaders, marking the formal beginning of a modern Moro nationalist movement. The MNLF was initially focused on securing an independent Bangsamoro state, with the vision of uniting the various Moro groups, the Maguindanao, Maranao, Tazig, and others, under a single political entity. The MNLF quickly gained traction among the Moro population, advocating for the recognition of the Moro people's distinct identity and their right to self-determination. This movement sought to rectify the historical injustices and ensure the preservation of Moro autonomy, much in the way that previous Moro resistance had sought to defend the Sultanates and maintain control over their lands. The Moro insurgency, led by the MNLF, resulted in violent clashes with the Philippine military, marking the beginning of the Mindanao conflict that has continued into the present day. The Philippine government, though it attempted various peace talks and agreements, such as the Tripoli Agreement in 1976, was unable to fully resolve the Moro issue. The conflict escalated, with the MNLF adopting both political negotiation and military resistance as tactics, ultimately leading to the establishment of the Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, ARMM, in 1989. Although this was a step towards addressing Moro demands for autonomy, it was far from achieving the full independence that the MNLF sought. The Subanen's quiet resistance and cultural survival. In contrast to the highly visible and militarized struggle of the Moros, the Subanen's resistance remained largely silent and cultural. While the Moro struggle for independence garnered national and international attention, the Subanen's fight for survival was a more subtle, yet no less significant struggle. Their primary weapon was cultural preservation, maintaining their language, rituals, and ways of life in the face of encroaching forces that sought to alter or erase their identity. Throughout the 20th century, the Subanen continued to live largely in isolation, away from the political turbulence that engulfed much of Mindanao. Their communities, often located deep in the river valleys and mountain ranges of Zamboanga and Misamis, allowed them to preserve their traditional way of life. The Subanen's relationship with the land was key to their survival. Their agricultural practices, deeply rooted in the environment, allowed them to maintain independence from the larger Philippine economy. They relied on a system of shifting cultivation, which was adaptable to the mountainous terrain of their homeland, and engaged in traditional fishing, hunting, and gathering. The Subanen's refusal to engage with the modern state and their avoidance of both government-run schools and missions, especially in the post-independence era, kept their cultural practices largely intact. While the Moros had established armed resistance movements, the Subanen's form of resistance was through cultural autonomy. The Subanen continued to honor their traditional leadership structures, with the Timue serving as the central figure in governance and maintaining a role in their spiritual and community affairs. One of the most significant symbols of Subanen cultural survival was the continued practice of the bucklog, a traditional Thanksgiving and fertility ritual. Though it was occasionally suppressed by colonial forces and later by the Philippine government, the Subanen persevered, conducting the ceremony in secret when necessary. This resistance, through spiritual and cultural expression, was a powerful testament to their determination to protect their heritage. The Subanen did not view themselves as rebels or insurgents, but rather as custodians of a cultural legacy that was central to their identity. Their form of resistance was not based on violent opposition, but on the deep and abiding need to preserve their way of life for future generations. The legacy of Moro and Subanen resistance. The Moro nationalist movement continues to shape the political landscape of Mindanao. Despite the challenges faced by the MNLF and other Moro groups, the quest for autonomy and recognition remains a central issue in the region. The establishment of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, BRMM, in 2019, following the historic peace agreement with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, MILF, marked a significant step toward resolving the Moro issue, although it remains a work in progress. For the Subanen, their legacy of quiet resistance is less widely known, but no less important. As the modern Filipino state continues to grow and integrate more of Mindanao into its political and economic systems, the Subanen's role in the region's history continues to be defined by their persistence in maintaining their cultural identity. The Subanen's resistance is not bound by military conflict, but rather by the strength of their traditions and their ability to withstand external pressures. Their enduring presence in the mountain and river valleys of Zamboanga and Misamis is a living testament to their unyielding resistance against colonization and modernity. Conclusion: two paths to survival. The histories of the Moros and the Subanen, while distinct, share a common theme: survival. Both groups fought against forces that sought to strip them of their identities, their lands, and their cultures. The Moros, through their armed resistance and the establishment of a nationalist movement, sought political autonomy and the preservation of their distinct way of life. The Subanen, in contrast, resisted through cultural preservation, relying on isolation and the strength of their traditions to survive in a rapidly changing world. While the Moros' struggle for independence is far from over, and their efforts continue to shape the political landscape of Mindanao, the Subanen's form of resistance remains a quiet but powerful force. Both the Moro and Subanen peoples have demonstrated that survival is not only about military might or political power. It is about holding on to one's identity, values, and cultural heritage. Their stories are not only about resistance, but also about resilience. The resilience of peoples who, despite centuries of external domination, continue to endure and thrive in their own ways. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the struggle for autonomy, both in the Moro and Subanen communities, continued to shape the political and cultural landscape of Mindanao. While the Moro nationalist movement gained momentum, eventually leading to the creation of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, BRMM, the Subanen, though less politically organized, maintained a quiet but unyielding resistance to external pressures, preserving their culture and land in the face of encroaching modernity. The Moro nationalist movement, a new chapter in autonomy. The Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF, which emerged in the late 1960s, sought to reclaim the Moro people's autonomy after years of marginalization by the Central Philippine government. The MNLF fought for a Bangsamoro state, envisioning a region where the Moro people could govern themselves in line with their Islamic faith and cultural practices. The movement was born out of frustration with the government's failure to address the Moro people's economic, political, and cultural concerns, and the widespread perception that the Moros were being treated as second-class citizens in their own land. The MNLF engaged in armed conflict with the Philippine military, especially in the 1970s, leading to widespread violence and displacement. The conflict escalated, but despite this, the MNLF was able to garner significant support, both domestically and internationally. It called for the recognition of the Moro people's right to self-determination, invoking the legacy of Moro resistance that had been in place since the Spanish period. While the MNLF sought political solutions through armed struggle, it also engaged in negotiations with the government. The Tripoli Agreement, signed in 1976, marked the first major attempt to address the Moro question. However, the peace process was far from straightforward, as mistrust and continued military engagements made real progress difficult. Despite the setbacks, the MNLF's role in advocating for Moro rights and autonomy paved the way for later developments, including the establishment of the Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, ARMM, in 1989 and the creation of the BARMM in 2019. The Subanen's quiet survival, challenges of modernity. Unlike the Moros, the Subanen did not directly participate in the armed struggles for autonomy or self-determination. The Subanen's resistance continued to take a different form, quiet, cultural, and often unseen by the larger world. Their resistance was rooted in maintaining their identity, traditions, and ways of life, often by avoiding full integration into the state system. In the face of rapid modernization and economic development in Mindanao, the Subanen have faced increasing challenges. The encroachment of logging, mining, and agricultural expansion into their ancestral lands has been a constant threat. The Subanen's reliance on the natural resources of their environment has made them vulnerable to external exploitation, as their lands are often targeted for industrial development. The Philippine government and various private entities have sought to convert the land for large-scale agricultural projects or mineral extraction, often without the full consent of the indigenous people who inhabit it. Despite these pressures, the Subanen have remained resilient. Their response to these challenges has not been through political movements or armed resistance, but through the continued assertion of their cultural practices and the defense of their land. Community elders, often the Timue, have played a key role in resisting outside forces by asserting land rights and maintaining the integrity of their traditional governance structures. The Subanen have also faced pressures from the government to integrate more fully into the national educational and economic systems. The introduction of public education and the push for modernization have threatened to erode traditional practices. However, many Subanen communities continue to educate their youth through their own systems, ensuring that cultural traditions are passed down while allowing them to navigate the demands of modern life. The preservation of their language, rituals, and communal values has remained central to their survival strategy. The Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, BARMM, and the Subanen's place. The creation of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, BARMM, in 2019 was a significant milestone in the Moro people's struggle for self-determination. It represented a hard-won victory for the Moro nationalist movement, following decades of armed struggle, negotiations, and peace talks. The BARMM was designed to give the Moro people greater control over their political, cultural, and economic affairs. It offered the Moros a degree of autonomy, including the right to establish their own government and manage their resources. However, the BARM's creation also posed challenges, as it required the integration of various Moro groups with differing political goals, and left the question of the Subanen and other indigenous peoples unresolved. The Subanen, though not directly part of the BARMM, found themselves in a difficult position. Their ancestral lands, particularly in Zamboanga and Misamis, were now situated within the boundaries of the autonomous region. While the BARMM promised to respect the rights of indigenous peoples within its territories, the Subanen's relationship with the new governing entity remained uncertain. Would the Subanen be able to maintain their cultural autonomy within the larger framework of the BARMM, or would they be subsumed under the new regional system? The Subanen were not opposed to the creation of the BARMM, but had their own concerns about being marginalized within a system that was primarily focused on the Moro majority. They sought assurances that their land rights, cultural practices, and governance structures would be respected and protected in the context of the newly established regional authority. In the face of this uncertainty, the Subanen continued to assert their identity and independence. Many Subanen leaders sought to engage with the BARM's governing bodies, advocating for the inclusion of indigenous peoples' concerns in the region's development plans. They pushed for the recognition of their distinct cultural heritage and the protection of their land rights, ensuring that their unique way of life would not be undermined in the quest for greater autonomy for the Moro people. A new era of resistance and survival. As the 21st century progresses, both the Moros and the Subanen continue to navigate the complexities of modern governance, economic development, and cultural preservation. The Moro people, now part of the BARMM, continue to push for greater autonomy and recognition of their distinct identity. The Subanen, meanwhile, persist in their quiet resistance, maintaining their traditional way of life while seeking to secure their place in the modern world. Both groups have demonstrated resilience and determination throughout their histories. While their paths to survival have been different, one marked by armed resistance and political struggle, the other by cultural preservation and isolation. Both the Moros and the Subanen continue to assert their right to exist on their own terms. Their stories are a testament to the enduring strength of indigenous peoples in the face of external pressures. A reminder that survival is not just about the ability to fight, but also the ability to adapt and endure. As the Moro people navigate the political landscape of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, BRMM, and the Subanen continue their cultural and environmental struggles, the future of Mindanao is being shaped by a complex interplay of modernization, autonomy, and traditional resistance. The ongoing tensions between the demands of development and the preservation of cultural heritage remain central to the survival of these communities. While the Moro people have made strides towards political autonomy, the Subanen face ongoing pressures from economic and environmental forces that threaten their way of life. The BARMM and the shift in Moro political dynamics. The creation of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, BRMM, represents a landmark achievement in the Moro people's long struggle for self-determination. For the first time, the Moros have a degree of control over their political, cultural, and economic affairs. The new region promises more autonomy than the previously established autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao, ARMM, providing the Moro people with the opportunity to manage their resources, govern their territories, and preserve their cultural practices within a more flexible framework. Despite these gains, the implementation of the BARMM has been far from straightforward. One of the central challenges lies in managing the diverse Moro groups within the region. The BARMM represents the merger of various Moro ethnicities, each with distinct histories, languages, and political goals. The Moros of Sulu, Maguindanao, and Lanuo, along with other groups, must now navigate the complexities of governance within the same territorial framework. While the BARMM provides an opportunity for greater autonomy, it also presents a significant challenge in balancing the interests and needs of these diverse groups. The inclusion of the Subanen within the BARM's broader governance framework further complicates the dynamics of the region. As non-Muslim indigenous peoples, the Subanen have unique concerns that are often overshadowed by the dominant Moro nationalist agenda. For many Subanen, the question of how their lands, traditions, and governance systems will be recognized and respected under BARMM remains an unresolved issue. They fear that the centralization of power within the Moro leadership could further marginalize their voices, as the political and cultural focus of the BARMM is primarily oriented around the Moro identity. One potential avenue for addressing these concerns is the inclusion of indigenous peoples' representatives in the BARM's governance structures. The BARMM law provides for a Commission for Indigenous Peoples, IP, which offers a mechanism through which the rights and concerns of indigenous communities like the Subanen can be represented. However, the effectiveness of this commission depends on the political will of the BARMM leadership to engage meaningfully with indigenous issues. The challenge for the Subanen lies in ensuring that their cultural autonomy and land rights are safeguarded within the broader framework of Moro governance. The Subanen and the struggle for land rights. The Subanen's ongoing struggle for land rights and environmental protection has been exacerbated by the rapid expansion of commercial logging, mining, and agriculture in Mindanao. These economic activities threaten not only the physical environment that the Subanen depend on for their subsistence, but also the very foundations of their cultural identity. The Subanen's traditional livelihoods, based on farming, fishing, and hunting, are deeply intertwined with the land, and any encroachment on their territories risks undermining their way of life. The Subanen's resistance to these developments is largely rooted in their refusal to relinquish control over their ancestral lands. These lands, which they have cultivated for centuries, are seen as sacred spaces that embody their history, culture, and identity. For the Subanen, their connection to the land is not merely economic, it is spiritual and cultural. The Timue, as the traditional leaders of Subanen communities, play a central role in protecting these lands and ensuring that they are passed down to future generations. In the face of external pressures, the Subanen's leadership structure has proven resilient, with the Timue acting as guardians of their people's land and traditions. Despite their efforts, the Subanen face significant challenges from the Philippine government and corporate interests. Government policies often prioritize economic development over the protection of indigenous lands, and the lack of a robust legal framework for the protection of indigenous people's rights leaves many Subanen communities vulnerable to land dispossession. In recent years, there have been growing calls for the recognition and protection of indigenous land rights, but these efforts have faced resistance from both government and corporate stakeholders seeking to exploit the region's natural resources. The Subanen's fight for land rights is also complicated by the influence of modern economic systems, which often prioritize large-scale development over local sustainability. The shift from traditional agriculture to industrial farming or resource extraction threatens not only the Subanen's access to land, but also their cultural practices. In the face of these challenges, the Subanen continue to resist through grassroots activism, legal battles, and the preservation of their traditional ways of life. Their resistance is one of endurance, as they work to adapt to the pressures of modernity while retaining their cultural autonomy. Modernization and its impact on indigenous identity. The forces of modernization present both opportunities and threats for the Moros and Subanen. For the Moros, the opportunity to govern themselves through the BARMM is a significant step towards securing their political and cultural future. However, the integration of the Moro people into the broader Philippine state system has led to tensions between maintaining traditional practices and adapting to the demands of modern governance. The BARM's commitment to education, infrastructure, and economic development may lead to greater prosperity for the region, but it may also come at the cost of cultural assimilation. For the Subanen, modernization presents a more immediate threat. The pressures of development, along with the influx of settlers and the imposition of government policies, continue to challenge their cultural survival. The Subanen's resistance to modernization is not an opposition to progress, but rather a refusal to sacrifice their cultural heritage in the name of development. Their fight for land rights, cultural recognition, and autonomy is a battle to preserve their identity in a rapidly changing world. Both the Moros and the Subanen, despite the challenges they face, have demonstrated remarkable resilience. Their resistance is not just a fight for survival, but also a fight for the recognition and preservation of their unique cultures. As Mindanao continues to evolve, the futures of these two communities are intertwined with the broader dynamics of political autonomy, cultural preservation, and the ongoing struggle to protect indigenous lands from the forces of economic exploitation. As the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, BARMM, continues to evolve, the future of Mindanao is shaped by the region's political dynamics and the ongoing struggles of the Moro and Subanen peoples. Both communities, while distinct in their histories and struggles, share common challenges related to identity, land rights, and cultural survival in a rapidly modernizing world. The resolution of these issues will play a significant role in determining the future of Mindanao, and the way these two communities navigate the complexities of autonomy, development, and governance will define their futures in the coming decades. The complexities of BARM's implementation. The creation of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, BRMM, in 2019 marked a pivotal moment in the history of the Moro nationalist movement. The region, which represents a significant step forward in the Moro struggle for self-determination, offers a unique opportunity for the Moro people to govern themselves and preserve their distinct cultural, religious, and political traditions. However, the implementation of the BARMM has not been without its challenges. While the Moro majority in the region has embraced the establishment of the autonomous government, the question of how to incorporate the diverse indigenous peoples of Mindanao, including the Subanen, remains unresolved. The inclusion of indigenous peoples' concerns in the governance framework of the BARMM is crucial for ensuring that the rights and autonomy of groups like the Subanen are respected. The Subanen, despite not being part of the Moro majority, share the broader struggle for recognition and the preservation of their way of life. The creation of the BARMM offers both opportunities and risks for the Subanen. While the region provides a platform for greater autonomy for the Moro people, it also risks marginalizing indigenous groups if their specific needs are not adequately addressed within the new political structure. A significant challenge lies in balancing the interests of the Moro majority with the needs of the Subanen and other indigenous peoples. The Subanen, with their distinct cultural and political identity, must ensure that their land rights, traditional governance structures, and cultural practices are protected in the new governance model. Indigenous representation within the BARM's governance system is essential to prevent the Subanen and other indigenous groups from being overlooked in favor of the Moro agenda. If their voices are not sufficiently represented, the Subanen may find themselves increasingly marginalized as the region moves toward greater political consolidation and economic development. The Subanen's response to political changes. While the Subanen have traditionally avoided direct political engagement in the larger struggles of Mindanao, they cannot remain isolated from the changes that the BARMM brings. The Subanen, unlike the Moros, have never had a political movement of the same scale, and their resistance has been largely cultural rather than militarized. Yet, the creation of the BARMM and its focus on governance and autonomy for the Moro people raises important questions about how the Subanen will engage with this new political reality. One possible path forward is for the Subanen to engage in dialogue with the BARM's leadership, advocating for the inclusion of their rights, especially with regard to land, culture, and governance, within the broader regional framework. The Subanen have long maintained a connection to their ancestral lands, and their traditional governance system, led by the Timue, remains central to their social structure. This system of leadership, which is grounded in consensus and the spiritual guidance of community elders, must be recognized and integrated into any framework of governance that impacts Subanen territories. Furthermore, the Subanen may seek legal recognition for their ancestral lands under the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, which guarantees indigenous peoples' rights to their lands, resources, and cultural heritage. The law, while offering protection, has often been difficult to enforce, particularly in areas where land grabbing and encroachment by mining or agricultural companies are prevalent. For the Subanen, the struggle for land rights is not only a matter of legal recognition, but also of cultural survival. Their connection to the land is spiritual and integral to their identity, making the preservation of these lands crucial for their future. Land rights and the environmental challenges. For both the Moros and the Subanen, land rights remain a critical issue. The Moro people's struggle for autonomy and self-determination is deeply connected to the control of land and resources in Mindanao, especially given the historical significance of land and their resistance to colonial powers. The MNLF and the MILFs movements have long been tied to their demands for control over their ancestral lands, which are seen as key to their cultural survival. Similarly, the Subanen, whose livelihood and traditions are closely tied to the land, are also engaged in a fight for the protection of their ancestral territories. However, the pressures on land and resources in Mindanao are intensifying. Large-scale mining, logging, and agribusiness ventures are encroaching on the territories of indigenous peoples like the Subanen. These industries, often operating without full consultation or consent from local communities, are contributing to environmental degradation, deforestation, and the loss of biodiversity. The Subanen's fight to protect their lands is intertwined with the broader environmental struggle in Mindanao, which involves not only indigenous communities but also other sectors of society concerned about the region's ecological future. The challenge for both the Moro and Subanen communities lies in navigating the complex relationships between political autonomy, economic development, and environmental sustainability. While the BRMM offers the promise of greater autonomy for the Moro people, its success will depend on its ability to balance development with the preservation of both the natural environment and the cultures that depend on it. The integration of indigenous rights and environmental protection into the development plans of the BRMM will be crucial in ensuring the long-term survival of both the Moro and Subanen peoples. The role of education and youth in shaping the future. In both Moro and Subanen communities, the role of education cannot be underestimated in shaping the future. For the Subanen, education has been a tool for survival, helping to ensure that the younger generation understands and maintains their cultural heritage. The government and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, have worked to provide educational opportunities for the Subanen, but the challenge remains to balance modern education with traditional knowledge. The younger generation must be equipped with the skills needed to navigate a rapidly changing world while also being grounded in the cultural practices that define their identity. For the Moro youth, the creation of the BRMM offers new opportunities for political and social engagement. The region's future will depend in part on how the younger generation takes ownership of their cultural and political autonomy. The Moro people have long fought for the right to determine their own destiny, and the next generation of Moro leaders will be critical in ensuring that the promises of the BRMM are fully realized. The youth must learn to balance their cultural heritage with the demands of modern governance, economic development, and social cohesion. Conclusion: the path forward. As Mindanao continues to evolve, the paths forward for both the Moro and Subanen peoples are deeply intertwined with the broader forces of modernization and governance. The creation of the BRMM represents a significant achievement for the Moro people, but it also raises important questions about the future of indigenous groups like the Subanen. Both communities face challenges related to land rights, cultural preservation, and the pressures of economic development. The future of Mindanao will depend on how these communities navigate the complexities of modernity, governance, and cultural survival. Both the Moros and the Subanen have shown incredible resilience in the face of centuries of external pressures, and their ability to adapt while preserving their identity will determine the course of their futures in the 21st century. As the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, BRMM, continues to take shape and evolve, One of the most pressing challenges remains how to integrate the concerns and rights of indigenous peoples like the Subanen into the broader governance framework. While the creation of the BARMM is a monumental achievement in addressing the Moro people's centuries-long struggle for self-determination, it also raises important questions about the rights of non-Moro indigenous communities within the region. The Subanen, with their distinct cultural practices, governance systems, and deep connection to their land, must ensure that their rights are fully recognized and protected within this new political system. A complex relationship between Moro and indigenous communities. The relationship between the Moro and indigenous communities like the Subanen in Mindanao is complex. The Moro people, though distinct in many respects, share many challenges with other indigenous groups in the region, particularly in terms of land rights and cultural preservation. Historically, both the Moros and the Subanen have faced encroachment from external forces, whether in the form of colonization by the Spanish and Americans or modern economic development pressures such as mining, logging, and large-scale agriculture. However, despite these shared struggles, the Moro people have long had a more centralized political identity, with powerful sultanates and established systems of governance. The Subanen, in contrast, have always been more decentralized, with traditional leaders, Timue, guiding their communities based on consensus and spiritual wisdom rather than formalized political structures. The advent of the BARMM, which seeks to unify the Moro peoples under a regional government, complicates the question of how indigenous groups like the Subanen, who are not part of the Moro majority, fit into this new structure. For the Subanen, the challenge is twofold: to ensure that their distinct identity and rights as indigenous peoples are recognized within the BARMM framework, and to ensure that their land rights are not subsumed under the new regional governance system, which is largely focused on the Moro population. The Subanen have historically resisted assimilation into larger political systems, preferring to maintain their traditional ways of life in the mountains and river valleys. Now, as the BARMM begins to take shape, their future in the region will depend on their ability to negotiate their position within the broader political framework and ensure that their rights are protected. The legal framework for indigenous rights. A significant step in addressing the concerns of indigenous peoples, including the Subanen, is the implementation of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, passed in 1997. The IPRA recognizes the rights of indigenous peoples to their ancestral lands, cultural heritage, and traditional governance systems. Under this law, indigenous communities are granted the right to manage their ancestral domains, a vital issue for the Subanen, whose way of life is deeply intertwined with the land they occupy. Despite the IPRA's protections, the Subanen, like many indigenous groups, have faced challenges in securing legal recognition of their land rights. The encroachment of large-scale mining, logging, and agricultural operations continues to threaten their ancestral territories. The Subanen's lands are rich in natural resources, which makes them vulnerable to exploitation. While the IPRA offers a legal framework for protecting these lands, the enforcement of these rights is often weak, especially when powerful corporate or government interests are involved. Moreover, the Subanen's relatively low political profile compared to the Moro majority makes it difficult for them to assert their rights within the BARMM. The region's focus on addressing the Moro people's concerns risks sidelining the Subanen, who are concerned that their rights to land and cultural preservation will not be fully respected under the new system. For the Subanen to successfully navigate this new political environment, they must engage with the BARM's governing bodies, advocating for the recognition and protection of their ancestral lands, traditional governance structures, and cultural practices. The role of the BARMM in indigenous representation. One of the most critical elements of the BARMM is its framework for indigenous representation. Under the provisions of the BARMM law, an Indigenous Peoples Commission, IPC, is mandated to ensure that the rights of indigenous peoples are upheld within the region. This is a positive development for the Subanen, as it provides them with a formal mechanism through which their voices can be heard and their rights can be defended. However, the effectiveness of this commission depends on the political will of the BARMM leadership to genuinely address the concerns of indigenous communities. The IPC's primary role is to advocate for the inclusion of indigenous rights in the region's governance and development plans. This includes ensuring that indigenous peoples' land rights are protected from encroachment, that traditional governance structures are respected, and that cultural practices are preserved. For the Subanen, the IPC must work to secure land titles for their ancestral domains, support the continuation of their traditional leadership systems, and advocate for their participation in the decision-making processes that affect their communities. However, the IPC is only effective if it is adequately funded, supported, and integrated into the BARM's decision-making processes. The Subanen must work with the IPC and other indigenous groups to ensure that their concerns are prioritized within the broader framework of Moro governance. They must also continue to engage with the Philippine government, advocating for the full implementation of IPRA and ensuring that indigenous rights are upheld at both the national and regional levels. Land rights and the threat of development. In addition to political representation, the issue of land rights remains one of the most pressing concerns for the Subanen. The influx of settlers, along with the growth of mining, logging, and agricultural industries, continues to put pressure on their ancestral lands. The Subanen have always relied on these lands for their livelihoods, and any encroachment threatens not only their economic survival, but also their cultural identity. The Philippine government's land titling system, while intended to provide legal recognition of land ownership, often fails to protect the rights of indigenous peoples. The Subanen, along with other indigenous groups, face significant hurdles in securing legal titles for their ancestral domains. The lengthy and costly process of land titling, combined with the influence of powerful commercial interests, makes it difficult for the Subanen to protect their lands from exploitation. Furthermore, the economic pressures of modern development pose a challenge to the Subanen's traditional way of life. Large-scale agriculture and industrial development threaten the environment, particularly in areas that are important to the Subanen for their agricultural practices and cultural rituals. The Subanen's resistance to these developments is not a rejection of progress, but a call for sustainable development that respects their cultural and environmental needs. Conclusion: protecting the future of Mindanao's indigenous peoples. As the BRMM continues to evolve, the Subanen, along with other indigenous groups, must ensure that their rights are fully incorporated into the region's political and governance frameworks. Their survival depends not only on their ability to preserve their cultural practices, but also on their ability to secure their land rights and ensure that future generations can continue to live on their ancestral lands. The Subanen's fight is a fight for recognition and respect, for a future where they can live in harmony with both their traditions and the forces of modernization. The success of the BARMM and the inclusion of indigenous peoples within this framework will depend on how well the concerns of all groups are addressed. The Subanen must continue to advocate for their rights, ensuring that their distinct cultural identity is preserved in the new political order of Mindanao. Their resilience in the face of centuries of colonization and development pressures is a testament to their enduring strength. As the future of Mindanao unfolds, the role of indigenous communities like the Subanen will be central to ensuring a just and sustainable future for all. The land of Mindanao, rich in natural resources, has long been a source of conflict and struggle. For the Subanen, as well as the Moro people, the preservation of their ancestral lands is not just an issue of political autonomy, but also one of environmental sustainability. As development pressures from agriculture, logging, and mining continue to grow, the traditional knowledge of indigenous communities, especially the Subanen, has become increasingly important in ensuring the protection of Mindanao's fragile ecosystems. environmental degradation, and the threat to Subanen land. Mindanao's rich natural environment, which includes vast forests, mountains, and rivers, has been a source of livelihood for indigenous peoples like the Subanen for centuries. These lands provide essential resources for food, shelter, and spiritual practices. However, the rise of large-scale logging and mining operations has placed this environment under serious threat. The Subanen, like many indigenous communities, rely on sustainable farming practices, hunting, and fishing, which are deeply interconnected with the land's health. As forests are cleared for agriculture or mined for minerals, the delicate balance of the ecosystem is disrupted, leading to soil erosion, water contamination, and loss of biodiversity.
Large corporations, often with the backing of government policies, have expanded into Mindanao's resource-rich areas, exploiting the land for profit. These industries frequently operate without the consent of local indigenous communities, and their environmental impact is often devastating. Mining, for instance, is particularly harmful as it involves the extraction of minerals from the earth, often with little regard for environmental regulations or the long-term health of the land. For the Subanen, these developments pose a direct threat to their survival. Their communities are increasingly displaced as their ancestral lands are taken over by mining companies, and their rivers, which have provided sustenance for generations, become polluted with toxic chemicals. The Subanen's reliance on their land for agricultural activities, such as rice farming and root crop cultivation, has become more difficult as their territories shrink and the land's fertility diminishes. The effects of this environmental degradation are not only economic but also cultural, as the land is integral to their identity and spiritual practices. Traditional knowledge as a tool for conservation. In response to these threats, the Subanen have turned to their traditional knowledge and practices to help preserve the land and its resources. Indigenous communities around the world, including the Subanen, have developed deep understandings of local ecosystems over centuries. This knowledge, passed down through generations, is rooted in the principle of sustainable resource management. The Subanen's traditional agricultural techniques, which include shifting cultivation and agroforestry, are designed to work in harmony with the environment. These methods allow the land to regenerate over time, promoting biodiversity and ensuring the long-term fertility of the soil. For example, the Subanen's practice of shifting cultivation involves rotating crops on different plots of land over several years. This technique prevents soil degradation by allowing the land to rest and recover, reducing the need for chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Similarly, the Subanen use agroforestry practices, integrating trees with their agricultural crops. This not only helps to preserve the forest cover but also promotes soil conservation, as trees help prevent erosion and maintain soil fertility. The Subanen also engage in spiritual practices that honor the land. Rituals such as the bucklog, a Thanksgiving ceremony, reinforce the connection between the community and the environment. These practices are not just cultural, but also serve as a form of environmental stewardship, as they emphasize the importance of living in balance with nature. The Subanen's spiritual beliefs, which are rooted in animism, hold that the land, rivers, and forests are sacred, and their protection is essential for the well-being of the community. In recent years, there has been a growing recognition of the value of indigenous knowledge in environmental conservation. International organizations, such as the United Nations, have increasingly acknowledged the importance of traditional ecological knowledge in managing natural resources and protecting biodiversity. For the Subanen, this means that their practices are not only culturally significant, but also critical to the broader effort to protect Mindanao's environment. The role of the Subanen in environmental advocacy. As external pressures on the land continue to grow, the Subanen have increasingly found themselves at the forefront of environmental advocacy. Their struggle to protect their ancestral lands is deeply intertwined with the broader environmental movement in Mindanao. Indigenous groups like the Subanen have become vocal opponents of large-scale mining and logging operations that threaten the region's ecosystems. They have worked alongside environmental organizations and local governments to push for stronger protections for the environment, and they have sought to raise awareness about the harmful effects of development on the land and the people who depend on it. One of the most significant challenges for the Subanen is ensuring that their rights to land and natural resources are recognized within the broader legal and political framework. Despite the protections afforded by the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, Indigenous communities often face obstacles in enforcing their land rights. Mining and logging companies frequently operate in areas where Indigenous land rights are not fully recognized, leading to conflicts between corporate interests and local communities. The Subanen's advocacy for environmental protection and land rights has led to legal battles as they seek to secure their ancestral domains from encroachment. Legal cases have been filed to prevent the destruction of their lands, and local leaders have called for greater enforcement of environmental laws. These efforts, however, are often met with resistance from powerful corporate and political interests that prioritize economic development over environmental protection. In addition to legal advocacy, the Subanen are also engaging in community-based conservation efforts. They have been working to restore degraded lands, protect local wildlife, and promote sustainable agricultural practices. This grassroots movement is essential in ensuring that the Subanen's traditional knowledge is passed on to future generations and that their environmental practices continue to be a vital part of Mindanao's sustainability efforts. The future of environmental protection in Mindanao. The future of Mindanao's environment, and by extension the future of its Indigenous peoples, hinges on finding a balance between development and conservation. As the demand for natural resources increases, the pressure on Mindanao's ecosystems will only intensify. For the Subanen, the key to survival lies in the continued recognition of their land rights and the integration of their traditional knowledge into broader environmental policy. The growing recognition of Indigenous knowledge as a tool for conservation is a positive step forward, but it must be supported by concrete legal and policy changes. The Subanen must continue to fight for the protection of their land, ensuring that their rights are upheld and that their environmental practices are respected. The future of Mindanao's environment and the future of the Subanen depends on the ability of Indigenous communities to continue their role as stewards of the land, protecting it for generations to come. So, what did you think about today's history? It's a story of resistance, resilience, and survival. The Moros and the Subanen are living proof that no matter how much time passes, the fight for one's identity and rights is never truly over. These histories are not just stories of the past, but continue to shape the future of Mindanao. Their lessons remind us of the importance of preserving cultural heritage, respecting the land, and understanding that history is still unfolding. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the heart of Mindanao. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more from the past that continues to shape our present, make sure to subscribe to History Teller YT. We'll continue to bring you stories of struggle, survival, and triumph. Keep an eye out for our next episode, and feel free to share your thoughts and comments below. Your support helps us keep these incredible histories alive. See you in the next history. Till then, take care.